From Struggle to Success. Introduction: The Dream. Alejandro sat on the balcony of his small home in a quiet town in Spain, gazing at the evening sky. The distant sounds of life, children playing, vendors calling out their wares, the occasional honk of a car, were all familiar. Yet, in his mind, he was somewhere far away, in a place he had never been but had dreamed of countless times. His thoughts were in English, or at least they tried to be. He imagined himself walking down the bustling streets of San Francisco, speaking fluently with his professors and classmates, discussing complex ideas in a language that felt as foreign to him as the stars in the sky. Alejandro's dream was clear: to become a software engineer in Silicon Valley, the heart of technological innovation. He had always been fascinated by computers, spending hours tinkering with old machines, learning to code from borrowed books and online tutorials. But there was one major barrier between him and his dream: his English proficiency. In his town, English was a language of the elite, spoken fluently by those who had attended expensive schools or had lived abroad. For Alejandro, it was a language learned in the classroom, limited to textbooks and grammar exercises. The real-world application of the language, with its nuances, idioms, and slang, was something he had never fully grasped. His father, a humble schoolteacher, had always emphasized the importance of English. "It's not just a language," he would say, "but a key to the world." He had seen how English had opened doors for others, allowing them to study, work, and live in places far beyond their small town. He encouraged Alejandro to pursue his dream, assuring him that with hard work and determination, he could overcome the language barrier. But Alejandro was skeptical. The few times he had tried speaking English outside the classroom, he had fumbled over his words, feeling embarrassed and out of place. The thought of speaking English fluently, especially in an environment where everyone else was a native speaker, seemed like an impossible task. Yet, deep down, he knew that if he wanted to achieve his dreams, he had to face this challenge head-on. The challenge: first steps. The next morning, Alejandro made a decision. He would enroll in the local English Learning Center. It wasn't a fancy institution, but it had a reputation for helping students improve their language skills. With a mixture of excitement and anxiety, he walked through the doors of the center for the first time. The classroom was small, with a dozen or so students seated in rows, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Becky, the English teacher. She was an older woman, stern but with a warmth that came through in her interactions with the students. Mrs. Becky had been teaching English for over 30 years, and she had seen many students come and go, each with their own struggles and aspirations. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and confident. "You are here because you want to learn English, not just to pass exams, but to use it in your lives. This is not an easy task, but it is not impossible either. With hard work, patience, and practice, you will improve." Alejandro sat at the back of the class, trying to absorb every word she said. The first lesson was a review of basic grammar, something Alejandro thought he knew well. But as Mrs. Becky began asking questions, he realized how much he struggled with the application of rules he had only memorized. She asked him to conjugate a verb, and though he knew the rules, he hesitated, unsure of himself. The class moved on to pronunciation, where Alejandro's difficulties became even more apparent. Mrs. Becky had the students practice common sounds that were often difficult for non-native speakers. The th sound in words like think and thanks was particularly challenging. Alejandro found himself stumbling, unable to produce the sound correctly. As the days went by, Alejandro became increasingly frustrated. He struggled to keep up with the pace of the class, often making mistakes and feeling embarrassed. The more he tried, the more conscious he became of his limitations. It didn't help that some of his classmates seemed to pick up the lessons much faster, making him feel even more inadequate. But Alejandro was determined. He knew that this was only the beginning of his journey, and he was not ready to give up. He began spending extra hours at the center, going over his notes and practicing in front of the mirror. At home, he tried speaking English with his family, though they found it strange and awkward. One evening, as Alejandro was working on his assignments, his father walked in and sat beside him. "I see you're working hard," he said, his voice full of pride. "Remember, learning a language is like planting a seed. It takes time to grow, but with care and patience, it will bloom." Alejandro nodded, grateful for his father's encouragement. But he knew that hard work alone wasn't enough. He needed to find a way to immerse himself in the language, to make it a part of his daily life, not just something he studied in a classroom. The turning point: finding motivation. One afternoon, while browsing the internet, Alejandro stumbled upon a wealth of resources for learning English that he had never known existed. There were websites offering free lessons, apps that allowed for practice on the go, and YouTube channels where native speakers taught English in an engaging and accessible way. Excited by this discovery, Alejandro began incorporating these resources into his daily routine. He downloaded apps that focused on vocabulary and grammar, setting reminders to complete daily exercises. He subscribed to several YouTube channels where he could listen to native speakers explain difficult concepts in simple terms. For the first time, Alejandro felt like he had access to the kind of immersive learning experience he needed. One day, during a break at the learning center, Alejandro met Maria, a fellow student from Brazil. Like Alejandro, Maria had come to Spain with a dream: to work as a journalist for an international news agency. However, her limited English proficiency was holding her back. They quickly bonded over their shared struggles, and soon they began studying together, helping each other with difficult concepts and practicing conversations. Their friendship became a source of motivation for both of them. Maria was strong in areas where Alejandro was weak, and vice versa. She helped him with pronunciation and conversation skills, while he assisted her with grammar and writing. Together, they pushed each other to improve, celebrating small victories along the way. Mrs. Becky noticed the change in Alejandro. She saw that he was no longer the hesitant, unsure student he had been when he first joined the class. He was more confident, more engaged, and more willing to take risks. She decided to challenge him further by giving him additional resources, English novels and newspapers that would help him expand his vocabulary and understanding of the language. At first, Alejandro found the novels difficult to read. The language was complex, full of words he had never encountered before. But he persisted, using a dictionary to look up unfamiliar words and making notes as he went along. Gradually, he found that he was able to understand more and more of the text, and his vocabulary began to grow. The newspapers were equally challenging, but they offered a different kind of learning. Through reading news articles, Alejandro not only improved his English but also gained a better understanding of global events and how they were reported in different parts of the world. He began to see how language could be used to convey information, shape opinions, and influence decisions, a realization that deepened his appreciation for the power of English. One day, Mrs. Becky assigned the class a project to give a presentation in English on a topic of their choice. For Alejandro, this was a daunting task. Public speaking was difficult enough in his native language, and doing it in English seemed almost impossible. But he knew this was an important step in his journey, so he chose a topic he was passionate about: the role of technology in education. Alejandro spent days preparing for the presentation. He wrote and rewrote his speech, practiced it in front of the mirror, and even recorded himself to listen to his pronunciation and intonation. When the day of the presentation arrived, he was nervous but determined. As he stood in front of the class, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and began speaking. The first few sentences were shaky, but as he continued, he found his rhythm. He spoke with conviction, using the vocabulary and phrases he had worked so hard to learn. When he finished, the class erupted in applause. Mrs. Becky smiled, proud of his progress. This small success was a turning point for Alejandro. It gave him the confidence he needed to keep pushing forward. He realized that while he still had a long way to go, he was capable of achieving his goals if he continued to work hard and stay motivated. Immersion, stepping out of the comfort zone. With his newfound confidence, Alejandro decided it was time to step out of his comfort zone and immerse himself fully in the English language. He heard about an English conversation club in the nearby city, where people from different backgrounds gathered to practice speaking English. It was an intimidating prospect, conversing with native speakers, but Alejandro knew it was the kind of challenge he needed. Maria agreed to join him, and together they attended their first meeting. The club was held in a cozy cafe, and as they walked in, they were greeted by a diverse group of people, some of whom were native speakers, while others were learners like themselves. The atmosphere was friendly and welcoming, but Alejandro couldn't help feeling nervous. The meeting began with introductions, and Alejandro stumbled through his, feeling self-conscious about his accent and pronunciation. The others, however, were encouraging, and soon the conversation flowed more naturally. They discussed various topics, from movies and books to current events, and though Alejandro struggled at times to keep up, he found that each conversation was a valuable learning experience. The real challenge came during a group discussion on cultural differences. Alejandro realized how much he still had to learn, not just about the language, but about the cultural context in which it was used. Idioms and slang that were common to native speakers were completely foreign to him. He often had to ask for clarification, and while this made him feel insecure, it also opened his eyes to the complexities of language learning. Over time, however, Alejandro began to adapt. He started to understand and even use some of the idiomatic expressions he had heard at the club. He learned the importance of context in language and how the same word or phrase could have different meanings depending on the situation. These were lessons that no textbook could teach, and they were invaluable to his progress. In addition to the conversation club, Alejandro began immersing himself in English media. He started watching English movies and TV shows, not just with subtitles, but actively listening and trying to understand the dialogues. He discovered that this was a fun and effective way to improve his listening skills and pick up new vocabulary. Comedies helped him understand humor in English, while dramas and documentaries introduced him to different accents and speaking styles. Alejandro also began listening to English music, paying attention to the lyrics and trying to sing along. At first, the fast pace of the songs made it difficult to keep up, but with time, his listening skills improved. He found that music was a powerful tool for learning pronunciation and rhythm in speech. Through these experiences, Alejandro gained a deeper understanding of the English language and its cultural nuances. He realized that learning a language was not just about memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules, but about immersing oneself in the culture and way of life that the language represented. The road to fluency, advanced challenges. As Alejandro's confidence grew, so did the challenges he faced. Mrs. Becky, recognizing his progress, began giving him more advanced assignments, particularly in writing. Writing had always been a weak point for Alejandro. While he could now hold a conversation in English and understand much of what he heard, expressing his thoughts clearly and coherently in writing was still a struggle. Mrs. Becky assigned him essays and formal letters to write, each more challenging than the last. At first, Alejandro found himself overwhelmed. His sentences were often awkwardly constructed, and he had trouble organizing his thoughts in a way that made sense. He would spend hours on a single paragraph, only to end up dissatisfied with the result. But Mrs. Becky was patient. She would go over his essays with him, pointing out where he had gone wrong and offering suggestions for improvement. She encouraged him to read more, emphasizing that reading was the key to becoming a better writer. Alejandro took her advice to heart and began reading not just novels and newspapers, but also essays, articles, and short stories in English. The more he read, the more he began to understand the structure of English writing, the way ideas were presented, the flow of arguments, and the subtle use of language to convey meaning. He started applying these lessons to his own writing, and slowly but surely, he began to see improvement. However, progress was not always linear. There were times when Alejandro felt like he had hit a plateau, where despite all his efforts, he didn't seem to be getting any better. He began to doubt himself, wondering if he would ever be able to achieve true fluency. It was during one of these periods of doubt that Alejandro decided to start a blog. He thought that writing regularly, without the pressure of grades or deadlines, might help him overcome his struggles. He began by writing about his experiences learning English, the challenges he faced, the small victories he achieved, and the lessons he learned along the way. At first, the blog had only a few readers, mostly friends and classmates. But as Alejandro continued to write, sharing his honest thoughts and feelings, more people began to take notice. Some were fellow learners who related to his struggles, while others were native speakers who appreciated his efforts. The positive feedback he received gave him the encouragement he needed to keep going. As his writing improved, so did his speaking. Alejandro found that the more he wrote, the more confident he became in expressing his ideas verbally. This newfound confidence was put to the test when he was invited to participate in a debate competition at the Learning Center. The topic was the impact of technology on education, a subject close to Alejandro's heart. The competition was fierce, with many of the participants being native or near-native speakers. Alejandro was nervous, but he had prepared thoroughly, using the research and writing skills he had developed over the past months. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and delivered his argument with clarity and conviction. To his surprise, Alejandro won second place in the competition. It was a significant achievement, not just because of the award, but because it marked a milestone in his journey to fluency. He had proven to himself that he could hold his own in a challenging environment, and that he was capable of achieving his goals. The test, facing the ultimate challenge. With his confidence bolstered by the debate competition, Alejandro decided it was time to take the next big step in his journey, the TOEFL exam. This was the test that would determine whether he was ready to apply to universities in the United States, and it was the ultimate challenge for any non-native English speaker. Alejandro knew that the TOEFL was a comprehensive test, assessing reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills. He began preparing for it with the same dedication and determination that had guided him through his English learning journey so far. He set a strict study schedule, dedicating several hours each day to different sections of the test. He focused on expanding his vocabulary, mastering complex grammar structures, and improving his essay writing skills. He also practiced listening exercises, paying attention to different accents and speaking styles. One of the biggest challenges Alejandro faced was the speaking section of the TOEFL. Unlike in casual conversations, where he could take his time to think and respond, the test required him to speak fluently and coherently under time pressure. He practiced by recording himself answering sample questions, then listening to the recordings to identify areas where he needed improvement. Maria, who had also decided to take the TOEFL, became his study partner once again. They spent countless hours practicing together, quizzing each other on vocabulary, discussing essay topics, and simulating the speaking test. Their support for each other was unwavering, and it made the daunting task of preparing for the TOEFL a little less intimidating. As the day of the exam approached, Alejandro's anxiety grew. He knew how much was riding on this test: his future, his dreams, everything he had worked so hard for. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself of how far he had come and how much he had achieved already. On the day of the exam, Alejandro arrived at the testing center early. He took a few deep breaths, trying to calm his nerves. The test was long and grueling, as expected. The reading passages were dense, the listening sections required intense concentration, and the speaking and writing tasks demanded both clarity of thought and expression. When it was finally over, Alejandro felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. But as he walked out of the testing center, a new feeling began to creep in: doubt. He replayed the exam in his mind, recalling moments where he had hesitated, where he hadn't been able to find the right word, where he had struggled to understand a question. What if he hadn't done well enough? What if all his efforts had been for nothing? The weeks that followed were filled with anxiety as Alejandro waited for his results. He tried to distract himself by staying busy, but the uncertainty was always at the back of his mind. He knew that this was the final hurdle before he could apply to the universities he had been dreaming about, and the thought of failure was almost unbearable. The result: a new beginning. Finally, the day arrived. Alejandro received an email notifying him that his TOEFL results were available. His hands trembled as he clicked the link to view his score. As the page loaded, he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, he saw the number he had been hoping for, a score that was not just passing, but well above the required threshold for the universities he wanted to apply to. A wave of relief and joy washed over him. All the hard work, the late nights, the countless hours of practice, it had all paid off. Alejandro had proven to himself that he was capable of achieving his dreams, and now, the doors to a future in Silicon Valley were finally opening. Alejandro wasted no time in completing his university applications. He carefully crafted his personal statement, highlighting not just his academic achievements, but also his journey of learning English, a journey that had taught him resilience, perseverance, and the importance of never giving up. Weeks later, the acceptance letters began to arrive. Alejandro was ecstatic to receive offers from several prestigious universities, each offering programs that aligned with his passion for technology. After careful consideration, he chose the university that felt like the best fit for him, both academically and culturally. The time had come for Alejandro to say goodbye to his family, friends, and Mrs. Becky. As he packed his bags, he reflected on how far he had come, from the hesitant student who had struggled with basic grammar and pronunciation to someone who could confidently communicate in English and hold his own in academic and professional settings. Mrs. Becky, who had been his mentor and guide throughout his journey, came to see him off at the airport. "You've done incredibly well, Alejandro," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Remember, this is just the beginning. There will be new challenges ahead, but I have no doubt that you will overcome them with the same determination and hard work that brought you here." Alejandro nodded, grateful for her words of wisdom. As he boarded the plane to the United States, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He knew that he was entering a new phase of his life, one that would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new experiences. But one thing was certain: he was ready. The journey of learning English had taught him more than just a language. It had taught him the importance of perseverance, the value of hard work, and the power of belief in oneself. With these lessons in his heart, Alejandro was confident that he could achieve anything he set his mind to. As the plane took off, Alejandro looked out the window at the clouds below, thinking of the journey that lay ahead. He knew that there would be more obstacles to overcome, more lessons to learn, but he was no longer afraid. He had already accomplished what once seemed impossible, and he was ready to take on whatever challenges the future held. Conclusion: a lifetime of learning. Alejandro's journey to learning English and achieving fluency was long and filled with challenges. But it was also a journey of growth, self-discovery, and ultimately, success. It taught him that learning a language is not just about mastering vocabulary and grammar, but about immersing oneself in a new culture, embracing new experiences, and having the courage to step out of one's comfort zone. As Alejandro began his studies in the United States, he continued to build on the foundation he had laid in Spain. He knew that learning was a lifelong process, and that there would always be more to learn, more to discover, and more to achieve. Through his journey, Alejandro became an inspiration to others, proving that with hard work, dedication, and the right support, anyone can achieve their dreams, no matter how impossible they may seem. His story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of never giving up, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. In the end, Alejandro's journey was not just about learning English, it was about discovering his own potential, and realizing that he was capable of achieving far more than he had ever imagined. And as he looked to the future, he knew that this was just the beginning of a lifetime of learning, growth, and success. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button.